Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. That is body camera video from the Las Cruces Police Department. Officer Christopher Smelzer is heard making the "choke you out" comment to a suspect who later died, Antonio Valenzuela. Smelzer was relieved of his duties, and Las Cruces police announced that neck restraints would no longer be allowed. This shocking video coming not long after this video that led to a national movement for police reform. It shows Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin with his knee on the neck of George Floyd for over 8 minutes, with Floyd dying after the incident. This candlelight vigil in downtown Las Cruces, just one of many protests across the nation calling for change. Welcome to Issues and Answers Police Reform. I'm Fred Martino. Our program today is in partnership with the NAACP and the League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico. For the next hour, I am joined by the president of the NAACP of Doña County, Dr. Bobby Green, and our guest, Doña County Sheriff Kim Stewart and NMSU Police Chief Stephen Lopez. We invited Las Cruces Police Chief Patrick Gallagher, but have not heard back to our request for him to join us on KRWG Public Media. Sheriff, I want to begin with your reaction to the national call for change and also give you a chance to talk a bit about the policy that you have and your feelings on police body cameras, which, as you know, the state legislature this week voted to require of all agencies in New Mexico.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me today. And I do believe that the national dialogue in this matter is long overdue. It's needed. I don't think any agency or institution could ever say that we shouldn't or couldn't improve. I think in some matters it's been too slow coming. That said, we do not use body cameras at this moment. We have car cameras, and they picture some peripheral movement around the front of the vehicle and some audio within so many feet of the vehicle. But other than that, we do not have them. I came into this office and that had not been the policy prior. That is something that is going to have to be now seriously contended with financially to bring us up to standards.
Aside from the financial matter, Sheriff, your thoughts on this new requirement, which will provide 120 days. This is also another requirement the state legislature approved to ensure that that video is available when an incident occurs. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I personally don't oppose body cams or vehicle cams as such. I think that that's where technology is in our country and in our world. The problem I think that I see is more of a priority need at this moment. I have some other very pressing needs, such as a radio ability of my units to talk with each other on the radio. That is a system that was new in 1980. And here we are today. This morning we had an incident where my deputy was rolling in a drain with someone, and the only person that could call out was a bystander who called for help. So we have some very pressing needs in addition to body cameras. And also the latest research, body cameras have been around for a while. The latest research is that they really maybe aren't the panacea that everybody hoped and believed early on in that technology that they would be.
Okay. Chief Lopez, I want to get your thoughts on body cameras, also the national call for change, because as you know, body cameras are really just part of that. There are a host of things that people are talking about, and we're going to get to that over the next hour. But your general reaction to what you're seeing around the nation and in our community, and then your comments on body cameras.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for having me here as well. At New Mexico State University, our police department's been using body cameras now for a little over 10 years. We're actually now on our 6th generation of body cameras. And so because we had them before people started really looking at them for the ability to try to monitor police activity, we got into it for a completely different reason. We just wanted to be able to capture as much of what happened during an incident as possible without having any political pressure. And I think that helped our officers a lot. I can see where, as legislatures mandate it, there is going to be some concern and some pushback from our agency. Budget is certainly going to be a concern from what we've seen. They are expensive. They're expensive to maintain. They don't last forever. You've got to keep up with the technology. We're not as much concerned with the 120-day storage requirement. We're maintaining them right now for 5 years. So our recordings are available going back that far. So gigabytes and terabytes are not that expensive.
And are they used on every call, Chief Lopez?
That's actually where we differ a little bit from the statute that has been drafted at this point. Right now, our officers have the discretion as to which calls they use them on. Obviously, if the governor signs the bill that was drafted, then we're going to have to use them on all calls. That is going to increase their use. And for busy officers, that's going to mean we have to change out batteries more often during a shift. That's additional expense. And we've found in some cases, an officer's not expecting to have an incident, and they're kind of ambushed and they don't have a chance to turn on the body camera. And I think in some cases, the way that the legislature has tried to address this, they're already blaming officers and claiming an officer has evil intent if he doesn't turn on the camera. And I don't really think that's true. I think from what we've seen, there are just going to be some cases where it just doesn't happen because that's not the priority the officer has at the moment. That doesn't mean the officer's bad or had evil intent. It's just the way sometimes things work. But I think as part of the national discussion, this is not changing behavior of police officers anywhere in the country. And I think the body camera footage that you already showed earlier kind of demonstrates that. It's not changing how officers police. It's just capturing a little more of what took place. So we need to continue that discussion on all of the other areas that we're going to be talking about today, plus more, because the body cameras by themselves aren't going to create a just society. We've got to address all of the underlying issues.
But of course, as you indicate, if this bill is signed as it has been approved by the New Mexico legislature, which is expected, certainly your department and all departments across the state will have to develop some sort of policies for ensuring that officers are turning on those body cameras for every call, so that there is that record of what occurred. Well, now we move to our first question from the president of the NAACP, who will be joining us for the entire hour today, Dr. Bobby Green. Bobby?
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you to KRWG for everything you do with your public service. We are greatly appreciative of it.
Thank you.
Chief Lopez, what are your thoughts about the 8 Can't Wait initiative, and how do you think it can be implemented here in Las Cruces?
Thank you, Dr. Green, for the question. I think most of the 8 Can't Wait, a lot of agencies are already doing, and you're not going to find much resistance from progressive police departments. I think things like de-escalation, we've been trying that for a long time. We've been training in the basic academies in New Mexico. Many of our agencies already do advanced training beyond that. Officers who get into police work for the right reasons don't want to hurt somebody else. And in my experience, I've seen they are much more willing to try to de-escalate if we've given them the tools and they have the opportunity to do so. And I think the same thing holds true for many of the other 8 can't wait items. We put out a letter to the community last week about our views on it from New Mexico State University, and we're in agreement. And we've even thrown out some additional ideas that we're hoping kind of catch on and take it beyond the 8 can't wait. I think the ultimate challenge we're going to have is we need to have honest, ongoing dialogue within our communities. And if we don't have that, we're not going to make progress, and the progress really needs to be made. Too many instances have occurred throughout the United States that demonstrate we still have a lot of progress that needs to be pushed forward.
Some work to do, indeed. Sheriff Stewart, what are your thoughts about the 8 can't wait?
Well, I think the chief brings up a couple of good points, is that a lot of that is currently in use already, or currently acceptable practice, best practices in our field. One of them is, I think, continuum of force and shooting at vehicles. You can't, there is case law, federal case law, Graham versus Connor, that now says use of force is actually a 3-pronged test. So it's severity of the crime, it's the level of resistance, and gosh, it escapes me right now, but it's a 3-pronged test. So it is not based on a continuum of use of force. And when you say, well, can you shoot at a car, a moving car, or can you shoot at a car? That's actually taken into account in these instances where the 3-pronged test is applied. So with exception of those two, I would say we already are in compliance ourselves. I believe one of them was carotid neck restraint or vascular neck restraint, whatever the phrase is today. I can't remember, but we've never taught that. We don't use it. That's not part of Doña Sheriff's history.
Okay, and just to review the 8 Can't Wait initiative before we move on, it is to ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require a warning before shooting, exhaust all alternatives before shooting, a duty to intervene, ban shooting at moving vehicles, require a use of force continuum, and require comprehensive reporting. And we may have time to revisit some of those specific items later in the show. Sheriff, I want to move on now to the actions that are taken after an incident does occur. As you know, different departments handle this differently, but in many places there are citizens review boards, and there is a call for this in the city of Las Cruces. I want to get your thoughts on the idea of a citizens review board when an incident is under question.
I did some research on this during the year I was running for office. And one of the really surprising things about it was that there were about 20 different ideas of how these review boards would be implemented and used, and there were no standards of best practice. It would really vary according to community or city. So one of the takeaways I had from that was, until we have a better fix, I believe, on what should that look like, I'm kind of hesitant to go into that locally. But I want to bring up that Dr. Green is on a terrific oversight board called the Law Enforcement Academy Board. And that is something that is run with the Attorney General is the chair of that board. And they actually address a very variety of disciplinary actions to include decommissioning for certain criterion or based on certain criterion. We're a state of about 2 million people. I believe if that board were given a little bit more funding, more organizational structure, better compatibility and authority to the director of the police or the state academy, I believe it could be very functional in terms of an oversight enforcement board. In other words, you have it to some extent already. Let's improve it. I think it has a lot of potential. And for small agencies, you know, the Eddy counties and the Cibola counties and Chavez, that's really not very practical. So I think as a state, we could do better in that regard.
Chief Lopez, your thoughts on this idea of a citizens review board when an officer's actions are under question?
I agree with Sheriff Stewart's comment that none of them are the same. For as many review boards as exist right now, that's how many different ways they are structured. And some of them seem to work a little bit better than others. Here within our own state, people are complaining about some of the review boards that have been set up and they're not getting cooperation, or they don't think they have enough power, or whatever the issues happen to be for that particular agency. At NMSU, we actually secured a grant from the Department of Justice 2 years ago to look into this for our NMSU community. And we've spent about the last 18 months after we got the grant actually awarded, looking at how this could be structured and who should participate. And we're just in the wrapping up processes of that. As we kind of mentioned in our letter last week to the community, though, a review board that is only reviewing incidents after they happen is kind of missing the point, because then something has happened. It's much better if we can get in front of issues and involve citizens in how we hire people, the type of officers that we're looking for, involve citizens like in the Law Enforcement Academy Board, not just in the 2 members that are appointed out of 9 who are citizens at large, but have more public participation in what training goes into police officers. Have advisory boards for chiefs and sheriffs that when issues come up, we can turn to them and say, hey, here's a policy we're thinking of putting out. Can you take a look at this for us and give us feedback? So I think it really needs to be a continuum that we engage the community from the hiring stages all the way through until, yes, when there is an incident. I do want to point out, though, for some of the viewers who may not be from the Las Cruces area, Doña County is a bastion of goodness when it comes to this. Decades ago, there was concern of corruption within one of the agencies, and the agency head was accused of civil rights violations. And the citizens of Doña County stood up, convened their own grand jury, kicked out the district attorney, and brought forth charges against that agency head and some of the officers. And I think that's great. And it really shows that the community does have options. And here in Doña County, they've been willing to stand up and do it.
Okay, thank you. Bobby.
Thank you, Chief. Speaking of citizens, what happens to complaints from citizens that could lead to disciplinary actions, and who actually gets to review those complaints?
It depends. In some cases, complaints that are what we would consider minor, that are having to do with technical aspects, like the officer didn't fill out my citation properly, those are going to be reviewed by the supervisor, and the supervisor will address that with the employee. It is documented in our system. Every complaint that comes in is documented. As the complaints get more serious, and especially if there are any complaints about racial biases or other motives like that, not only do we investigate those are actually sent to the New Mexico Attorney General's office and are posted online. So any citizen can actually go out and find those.
Sheriff Stewart, what happens to complaints from citizens that can lead to disciplinary actions, and who gets to review those in your office?
Okay, bear in mind that not only can citizens do complaining or bring complaints forth, but any use of force, no matter how minor, is investigated by our internal affairs. It goes through a process. We know it as Blue Team, and those automatically get submitted for review. Now, there's all levels of investigation. So if it's a routine matter and it can be solved or wasn't not founded at a sergeant's level, it can stop there. Certain things, though, must progress through the chain, the disciplinary investigative chain. Now, there's a couple things to remember. I have unionized deputies, so they also have some role in terms of coming back on discipline that's been meted out on behalf of their membership to grieve a process or to grieve a discipline. Those investigations can go all the way. They go all the way to me. Sometimes they're stopped at a lower level. And then the other thing I want to make you aware, the employees of Doña County Sheriffs are the employees of the county. They're not my employees. So HR plays a role in a lot of this process as well at a certain level. So I guess what I'm trying to say poorly is a lot of eyes have some oversight in this process. And then, of course, if there are sustained actions that can result in either discipline or termination, that goes to a hearing. So I'm occasionally involved all the way to the hearing level where people are contesting the outcome of these investigations. Now, in terms of the public having access, I guess the public in our case is the human resource for the county. That's a civilian oversight in a way already.
Well, believe it or not, we're almost halfway through our program with Doña County Sheriff Kim Stewart and NMSU Police Chief Stephen Lopez. And joining me in the questioning today is the president of the NAACP of Doña County, Dr. Bobby Green. Sheriff, moving on, so far the protests in the Las Cruces area have been peaceful, but there have been reports of an armed militia that has been cited in the area, and as you're aware, there was also a shooting at a protest in Albuquerque. What can be done to protect our citizens in light of the fact that we're likely to see more protests and possibly more counter-protests?
Well, with regard to the group you mentioned, I want to say very clearly that it was brought to law enforcement's attention early on at the earliest protest that those people were on the periphery of those protests. And there was obviously an exchange of information between all the involved law enforcement agencies about their presence. It was a very minimal presence. And, you know, I have to really compliment the people of Doña County and the city of Las Cruces, because apparently those folks never found much of a foothold here. Because that one appearance, they were gone. So I don't think they found a group, so to speak, that might find their services necessary or even valuable. So I thought that spoke a lot for us. And that's how we protect. I know that the other side of the coin, so to speak, is that there's a peaceful protest and the presence of law enforcement is viewed by some as a negative, but the flip side of that's how we protect people participating in these protests from outside interference.
Well, Sheriff,
just as we've seen various cars running through protesters.
Yeah, Sheriff, you mentioned that law enforcement agencies shared information. Are you comfortable that there's enough intelligence that's going on in advance of protests to ensure that our law enforcement agencies know what groups might show up so that they're well prepared to deal with threats? I mean, I'm thinking, while, as you say, we haven't had maybe reason for alarm yet, it doesn't necessarily mean that there never will be an incident. I mean, I'm thinking of a few years ago, even a city council discussion about gun safety legislation prompted large numbers of people to show up at a meeting armed with sometimes very threatening weapons. And it was a very uncomfortable situation for a lot of people, not least of which the city council members at the time.
Well, let's make a distinction. They may be armed and have a right to have open carry in this state. Doesn't mean they're militia members. So, going back to your question of, do you think we have adequate intelligence? I think the chief would agree with me, at least in the last couple of years. We've been, as a community of law enforcement agencies, very good about sharing resources, working together, and being very open with one another about information we obtain. In other words, I haven't seen a whole lot of ego involved in all this. I think we've been out for one and one for all.
Yeah, and of course, I didn't mean to suggest that if people show up at a meeting showing off their weapons, that they're in a militia, but certainly that was very threatening to a lot of people, and this is certainly in New Mexico and in the West. This is not uncommon to occur when discussions occur about things like protests, like gun safety legislation. Chief Lopez, your thoughts on this, and your thoughts as well on the intelligence gathering. Is it enough? Do we need to do more?
I agree with Sheriff Stewart. We've got a great working relationship with the agencies in our area at all levels, from local, state, and federal. Unfortunately, we only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know, and therefore can't share that. And it's not like there is a well-defined group out there who might present danger. Danger could come from an individual who just simply decides to act on their own. It could come from somebody who's associated with one movement or another and decides enough is enough and they want to bring attention to it. And those are always our concerns. However, we also have to keep in mind that the presence of law enforcement, as Sheriff Stewart said, can sometimes have a quelching effect on protected First Amendment speech. So we need to balance how we deploy our personnel, how many we have present, what they're doing. And it always helps when organizers of events work with us, because then we're able to actually discuss, hey, here's what we're hearing. What are you hearing? Do you have anybody that is concerned? Here's what we're planning. Does that work for you? And make sure that we're helping them put on an event that succeeds and that they don't feel they're having their rights infringed upon.
Okay, thank you. Bobby.
We've had reports of hangings, one woman, one female, 4 men, and a 17-year-old boy. All of those incidents have been ruled suicides. To me, this seems highly suspicious. How would you investigate those incidents?
I think that we need to be suspicious of any death, and that's what we do at New Mexico State University. Any death that we have, we start off investigating it as a homicide, and we work the evidence. And if the evidence leads us to, yes, this was a suicide, then that's how we'll end up with that determination. But we never start off thinking, well, this must be a suicide. Unfortunately, we do know mental illness is a problem in the United States, and untreated mental illness does have a direct connection to suicide. So it does happen, much more than any of us would like to see it. But I think we have to be very skeptical, especially in times like this, of any death. And I'm sure anybody who's watched television shows knows some criminals out there will try to stage things to make it look like it may be a suicide. So we have to handle things as if it is a serious homicide. Now, that's easy for our agency to do because of such a low frequency of those incidents. I'm not sure how an agency like Chicago, who has 15 or 20 murders in a single weekend, works in then the additional workload. They're just in a really tough situation. But I think that's how we handle it, and I think it's a good practice.
You make a good point that all of those incidents were in highly populated areas too. So you do make a good point. Sheriff Stewart, what would you do in investigating those hangings?
Well, as the chief said, that they all come to us as homicides, or we begin to look at them in that fashion. And that extends to unattended deaths. We go on unattended deaths quite frequently, unfortunately. So there isn't the presumption immediately that this or that happened. I think part of being good investigators and detectives is to keep your mind open. There's something in our line of work called tunnel vision, and it's very easy where you're trying to set the circumstances and the evidence to come out to a predetermined conclusion. Okay, so if you go into it believing that it's a suicide, or believing that it's this, or it's believing it's that, you can be carefully, not so carefully, led astray. So I think that is a very big part of continuing education and training. As the chief said, he has a very small agency. Although we're a little bit bigger, we're certainly not on the scale of even a peripheral city or town in Los Angeles County. So we're quite small, and you have to ask yourself, how do we keep our level of abilities and training up, even when we're not tasked to do those every day or every week? And I think that's incumbent on the agency to keep up with the best practices, keep your people trained. If you're going to cut money, please don't cut money from training. That seems to be the place everybody wants to cut. And to me, that's just a recipe for disaster. So, and you bring up an interesting point. You're saying they were all hangings, I believe. The other part of our challenge is not jumping to the conclusion they're all related, or jumping to the conclusion they're all unrelated. So it's like I say about detective work, it's an art and a science, and I think we have to feed both of those.
Okay. Thank you for that, Sheriff. And speaking of resource allocation, a question that I'm sure you've gotten already behind the scenes, in the midst of a pandemic, do you think that it would be a good idea to reduce or eliminate the number of routine traffic stops?
Starting March 8th, we reduced dramatically. So I attribute the fact that we are COVID-free as of today. And part of that was to reduce maybe those non-essential contacts. And therefore, weren't making stops for tail lamps out, or license plate lights not lit, or something of that nature. And I think we're seeing the result of that very wise decision now, because and we have not resumed those activities. So we do have a traffic unit. They might be a little bit frustrated, but it certainly has spoken well about keeping us healthy. And that was our goal at the beginning of all of this, is if we made it to the end of the year and had 0 cases, we could still continue to serve our community.
Okay, Chief Lopez, your thoughts on this?
We've actually done the opposite. We've continued to have all of our normal operations conducted. So we're still out there doing traffic enforcement, much to the surprise of a few people that we've stopped. However, we have altered our workplace practices. So when this started, we had adequate supply of personal protective equipment for our staff. We went through and did refresher training, and then we started talking with them about how do we do a safer traffic stop. If there's only a single driver in the vehicle, no other passengers, is a passenger side approach better for us? If the officer's wearing their N95 mask and now we've got 5 or 6 feet of distance, is that good? And then we also started talking about if there are passengers in the car, can we go ahead and ask the driver, please step out of the vehicle, bring your driver's license, insurance, and registration with you, and we'll talk over on the side on the curb where it's safe and where we are able to maintain that social distancing. We can avoid getting too close even when we're handing documents by putting the driver's license, say, on the trunk of the car and exchanging things that way. And if the wind is blowing, we've been training our officers, try to stay upwind or with a crosswind so that anything that does come out is beneficial. As more people are actually wearing face coverings, and certainly it's not everybody, but as more are doing so, it's also been nice because that also gives an additional layer of protection for our officers. The last time we talked about it as a staff a few weeks ago, the officers indicated that they feel safe, and certainly their activity indicates that. One of the reasons why we felt it was important to look at how we continue it is because we're just not quite sure how long we're going to be in this.
Yeah, and as of right now, as of our taping, is your department COVID free?
We are
Great.
COVID free.
That's good to hear.
As far as official testing,
yeah.
Though some of us were sick back in January and February, and we don't know what we had back then.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you're not tested, you don't know for sure. But
Right.
at least it appears as if everyone is COVID free, and that's good to hear. Bobby, we're going to move on to you now for the next question.
Okay, Chief Lopez, you alluded to this earlier, but I'm going to ask the question now. How can we change the vetting process in hiring officers to eliminate the bad apples before they get badges and guns?
I think you're alluding to my comment about we need community participation in this part, and absolutely, I think community participation is important. Some agencies are so strapped, they're struggling right now to hire police officers that they've actually started becoming less selective. We've made the decision on our side to maintain the highest standards we can. And if we have to go with a vacancy, we go with a vacancy. We'd much rather do that than hire somebody into the organization that is A, not going to represent us the way that we think they should, and B, is going to cause problems in the community because of their actions. So psychological testing, absolutely important. Good oral communication skills, important. The ability to talk with a wide variety of people, important to screen for. We actually require new officers coming in to have a college education, which is not very common in this region, but we think it makes a difference for us. And we actually require each candidate to go through multiple oral boards. And on those oral boards, we have members of the community helping us look for people that are going to fit our community standards.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Sheriff Stewart, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I have to give credit to Chief Lopez. I also agree that the time for our workforce to have college degrees, I believe, is quite overdue. And he says it's not normal or routine in our area. I don't believe it's routine in the United States. So I think that's wonderful. We do not require it, although we certainly look to those who have done at least 2 years of college at a community college level. One of the challenges in places where you don't have a lot of diverse demographic per se is to look for diversity of thought. If I were to get diversity of thought on my workforce, I would in fact ultimately encourage diversity of demographic. Okay, so rather than people have asked me, well, why don't you go out and hire more women? Well, that's like where exactly would I be going to find them, number one? And that's a challenge, and I'm sure the chief would agree. That's been asked of me for 40 years. I was one of the only one, and I'd get sent out to find more women, and it just doesn't work that way. So we have looked at the panels to evaluate these applicants to ask questions that are certainly more based in not so much technical knowledge, but how would you handle this? When you get into a circumstance of X, what do you see? Okay, what is community policing to you? Not what I, the sheriff, have written on our brochure, but rather what does that mean? What could it look like? And I think that we just produced 15 graduates. I think we started with 23 or 4. We didn't have a lot of loss. Of course, 2 are the chiefs, so I can't really add them. I'd like to add them to our numbers. But the reality is that we have done something right in the sense that we had a better pool and we graduated a higher level of accomplishment. That said, we're reviewing that whole process before the next academy in January to see that, are we looking for the right people? Are we attracting the people that we need for a very complex world of law enforcement? And that's it. We're a profession. We're not the day of being blue collar workers. I'm sorry. I think we have to get that mindset out.
Sheriff, the next
and thank
question
you, Sheriff
is
Stewart, for allowing our officers through your academy.
Thank you, Chief Lopez. Sheriff, this next question is really a difficult one, and I know for any department must be an incredibly challenging issue. How can police who speak up about bad police behavior be protected from retaliation within their ranks?
That is probably, to me, the one point where the top matters. The absolute top matters, okay? Because if you, as the top leader of that agency, aren't leading every day from the standpoint that retaliation is not tolerated, that we're not going to cover up for each other the thin blue line or the big blue line or whatever it is, we don't do things that way. But you don't do that when there's been a problem, okay? Or that there's a problem emerging. You do that every day before you're at that point. Because I have promoted in my own shop that it's not going to be tolerated. We're not going to hide bad behavior. We're not going to be not transparent. That's not the way we operate here. But you have to do that when it's not a panic, when it's not a drama, when it's not on the front of the newspaper. Because if you're going to try it that way, it's not going to work. And that's how you protect people. You say no to retaliation. You say no to covering up wrongdoing, and you lead by example. I don't know any better way to do it. And though there are other situations where you could say, well, that's a top-down problem or a bottom-up problem or both, I think this is one where it definitely starts at the top. And that's where we definitely need the most pressure on those people at the top to protect those people in their care.
Chief Lopez.
I'm in absolute agreement with Sheriff Stewart. Leadership is absolutely instrumental in addressing that. And I think making that leadership message clear to people who are applying to our agencies so that they realize, hey, if I'm coming into this agency, this is what the expectation is. And if they don't like it, they can self-select out and go somewhere else. I prefer if they don't like that message that they just get out of law enforcement completely. But we've definitely got to step up as leaders and make sure we set an example and set the tone.
And of course, unfortunately, as we've seen recently in Minneapolis with the George Floyd case, it is so essential to create that culture where officers will speak up, not just after the fact, but during an incident to stop abuse. It is just absolutely critical. Probably one of the, for so many people watching this show, one of the most unbelievable things to think that there were several other officers there during that incident, and it was unimaginable. And then right after that incident, seeing in Buffalo, New York, where an elderly man was knocked to the ground and blood was pouring from his head, that we saw officers who walked by after that happened. And then after the incident, there was support for the two officers who were being charged in that case, even though it was clearly on video that this was something extremely alarming. Bobby, I know you have more on this in our next question.
Well, I think that some of it comes down to implicit biases. And implicit biases, to me, they seem to be highly problematic, particularly for people of color in this country. What can be done, Chief Lopez, to implement policies that prohibit implicit biases in police practices?
I think, Dr. Green, one of the challenges that we have is first understanding it's not just a policing problem. We have this problem throughout our society. So the officers we're hiring from the general community have been part of this environment before they ever even get to us. And we need to find a way to get that out into kids when they're young, so that they understand what's taking place in the environment around them, and get them involved in coming up with a problem, so that our next generation of police officers comes into us with that better understanding. But realizing that's going to take time, it's going to be a challenge for us to identify what is it that is going on that creates this implicit bias, this kind of us versus them, without us realizing there's this difference. And in large part, from my standpoint, we need communication with our community members to find out how they feel they're being treated differently or treated wrongly. Because at least with my staff, I'm confident my staff is not there to try to get people. They're here because they want to make a difference for good in our society. So if they're doing something wrong, it's because they don't know. And we need to find ways to open that communication up with our community, to find what those issues are, so that we can look at, all right, how do we now address this, and involve the community throughout that entire process.
Sheriff Stewart, typically when you have an incident of the killing, particularly of a Black man, it's often reported that the officer states that he was in fear of his life. And to me, that seems to be an implicit bias. What do you think can be done to implement policies that prohibit implicit biases in police practices?
Well, I'll age myself right now. I went to the academy. I graduated 40 years ago this month. And I'm going to say that my observation in and around this industry has been that police were asked as an institution to solve the national problem of racism. And you know, institutions don't solve racism, people do. And I think that I'm kind of shocked that we're shocked that we didn't cure racism through institutions, but we didn't. And, you know, I think there's a level of personal reconciliation that has to go on with each of us in this country. And you can say, well, that's, you know, not really resolving law enforcement issues or some of these other healthcare discrepancy in healthcare services, et cetera. But the reality is that this is a national dialogue that we've managed to ignore for I don't know, Dr. Green, 400 years. We've done really well at saying it's somebody else's problem. Well, you know, it's our problem. And if you're not accepting that there is this level of implicit bias in everything we do, I'm going to say that law enforcement is good, but we're not good enough to solve it. And as the chief says, it really has to begin long before And that goes back to that national dialogue where we need to come to grips with the fact that things happen in our history, and we need to admit that we were part of the problem, okay? Because without that, we will never be part of the solution. So I was an affirmative action hire. I'll say that proudly because of allowing women in the field, men under 6 feet tall can be police officers, if you didn't know that. That was all because of women being allowed into the workforce. So did affirmative action solve all of our issues and all of those implicit biases? Not by a long shot. It got a few more of us into the mix, but there needs to be a lot more of us, whatever us is, in order to really impact those institutions for the better.
Sheriff, moving on now, as you know, the officer in Minneapolis, no longer an officer, now in jail, Derek Chauvin, who is charged in the death of George Floyd, had many other complaints against him going over many years, all throughout his career. It was revealed after his arrest. What type of warning system do you think should be put in place to address officers who might be on a repeat basis doing things that are not up to standard or even committing abuse?
I am all in favor of tackling small problems before they get to be big problems. And I think the chief made a comment peripherally about this. Look, I don't know anything about that case. I don't know anything about that officer, but I can tell you that along the way, people knew he was a problem. And for whatever reason, his small infractions, if you want to call it that, because I believe there were a number of them, were overlooked or disregarded or ignored. And I suggest, and in my own shop, we're going to tackle those. I'm not talking about minor infractions, firing people, but maybe we need to look at, EAP issues. Maybe those are acting out from anger problems in their own life, etc.
And we should, and
a lot of those
get that acronym, EAP, Employee Assistance Program. That's exactly
Correct.
the kind of thing I was thinking about, that officers are under enormous stress and pressure and dealing with difficult situations, especially in a big city, every day. And if they are having trouble dealing with that, and on top of that, sometimes maybe having trouble at home, you need to have intervention. But it's difficult if there is no one who, when incidents come up, who addresses it and says, hey, you've had 5 complaints in the last 2 years, and I'm getting a feeling there's a pattern here. Something's going on.
And I don't want to say this is true in our case, but you have police union involvement. So in some of these big areas and organizations, the union's very strong. So those seemingly minor infractions, you can have a lot of pushback on early on that will keep the agency from really tackling them and really going after them when they're manageable level.
Let me ask you this, Sheriff. I
don't want to blame police unions.
Right. Yeah. Let me ask you this. We all know that incidents like this, where there are people who may have been involved in questionable behavior multiple times before action is taken, you don't always have that opportunity to get involved. You may not even get a report of a problem. It may not occur. I'm wondering, since it appears as if now we are going to have a requirement of body cameras, if a good policy would be, even though it may not be mandated by anyone, it would be a good policy for, on a routine basis, for supervisory review of incidents on those cameras, even when a complaint isn't filed, especially an arrest, for instance, to see, is procedure being followed? Is the language to the suspect revealing anything, or is it professional language?
Yes, and we actually, as I said, we have car cameras. So our supervisors actually do this. And to be honest, they need to do it more. We, in the last year, have encouraged them to do it more, be more proactive as the supervisor, because it's not because you're micromanaging people, it's because I have a lot of deputies who have under 5 years experience. Basically, they need constant mentoring. So be the mentor to them, reach out when you think, even if there isn't, as you say, a problem, but there's a point at which we could make an impact, either through some counseling, some mentoring, whatever you want to call it. Non-disciplinary, just say, you know, I saw how you handled this, this might be a better way. Our sergeants, I'm sure it's true with Chief Lopez, our sergeants answer calls with our folks. So they know how their deputies are handling routine matters. And we've encouraged them even more after I came in to please take that step out, because I firmly believe that somebody knew about that deputy, that officer in Minneapolis. Somebody knew. And that was quiet stuff.
Yeah, well, so important to start this dialogue, and we appreciate your time so much today. Believe it or not, we have run out of time. That is Issues and Answers Police Reform. We want to thank our guest, Doña County Sheriff Kim Stewart and New Mexico State University Police Chief Stephen Lopez. I also want to give a big thank you as well to Bobby Green. Dr. Bobby Green is the president of the NAACP of Doña County and a partner in this effort at KRWG Public Media. Another partner is the League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico. Thank you all for being part of this continuing effort to raise the level of awareness in our community about how these issues are being handled.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you to KRWG.
Now for all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a good week.